book lovers, Kaylee here. Welcome back to the Enchanted Library, and as you're watching this, it's my birthday. As you can probably guess from the title of this video, I am, yes, indeed 30 years old today. My 20s, they were okay, but I am so excited for my 30s. Like, I have so many plans for my 30s. I am so excited for a fresh new decade, which is so crazy to say. I don't really feel 30, I will tell you that. I still perpetually feel like I'm 22 years old. That's just gonna be me forever, I feel like. But I've really been wanting to do something like this for a video because I think 30 books for 30 years is just perfect. Because I have had quite a few people ask me what my reading tastes are, what genres I really like, and if you ever wanted to know what my reading tastes are, this video is going to be perfect because it is just me in a nutshell. So what I have planned for today's video is to talk you through 30 of some of my favorite books of all time. 30 does not even begin to encompass all of my favorite books, but I figured this would be a really good snapshot for you to see what I have read from basically the time that I was 10 years old until now, and to give you an idea of my tastes. So I will say anything that I read from like ages 1 to 9 I don't think are going to be in this, so that means no Calvin and Hobbes, no Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Full House Michelle, Berenstain Bears, that sort of thing. So those aren't going to be included because those are like childhood books, but once I started reading like full-fledged books, that's what this video is going to be. So I guess without further ado, let's start talking about the books. I basically just have them all in a stack to my left here, well, multiple stacks, and I'm just gonna grab the first ones that I see. So the first one that I actually picked up is a historical fiction, and that is Atonement by Ian McEwan. Now, I particularly love this book because it is just so beautiful and heartbreaking and heartwarming, and I just absolutely loved it so much. I remember reading this book before the film came out because initially the trailer of the film got me interested, so I picked up this book before I went to see the movie, and I remember reading this so quick, and then the moment that I put this book down, I immediately watched the film. So I was basically bawling my eyes out for several hours because of this story, and I just absolutely love it. It basically follows these two lovers who are caught by the girl's younger sister, and she perceives something that may or may not have been true, but she is a child and she doesn't quite understand what she's looking at, and it ends up putting everything on hold, and just their story is just so beautiful. I really want to do a reread of this book, but I don't think my heart could handle it. And the next book we are going to transition to is a classic, and I did talk about this book recently, but I couldn't not include it, and that is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. This is a staple of Canadian childhood. I feel like everybody should read this series. And oh, also, when I talk about the first book, I'm pretty much including all of the books. So any first book in a series that you see here, it's going to encompass the whole series. But back to Anne of Green Gables, this follows the life of orphan Anne Shirley and her journey to staying at Green Gables. And she was initially sent there under the premise that she was an orphan boy who would be able to help out around the farm, but then she instills herself into the hearts of Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, and her story just takes off from there. The next book that I have here is actually probably breaking my own rules that I just made, but it is a book that I've read, or a series that I read earlier than 10 years old, so I'm still including it though because these stories were so much of my childhood, and that is the Nancy Drew stories by Carolyn Keene. And these books were just so inspirational as when I was a young girl, because it was just a strong, self-sufficient woman who, even in her time, should not have necessarily been considered that and could have been taken completely wrong. But I just felt so connected to Nancy Drew when I was younger, and I really wanted to be her. I went on a kick where I read Nancy Drew, Alex Mack, Harriet the Spy. Like, I went around my neighborhood trying to be a spy and uncovering my own mysteries. Like, that is true fact right there. The next book that I have here is The Hidden Diary of Marie Antoinette by Carolee Erickson. And this book I remember picking up when I had initially begun to love the historical monarchy, and I thought that this book was so well done. If you don't know Carolee Erickson's works, she is a really amazing author where she brings history to life in a really interesting way. There's another book that she wrote, but I only wanted to really include one from her in this list to encompass all of her work, but she just has such a really great method of storytelling. This is actually written as a diary of Marie Antoinette's life and gives you a little bit more of inner workings into her thoughts and everything leading up to the demise. And I just thought that she did this in such an interesting way where she took all of the true events that happened to Marie Antoinette and then also interwove them with this other subplot. I really enjoyed this book. I remember recommending it to so many people who love historical fiction that I know, and if that is including any of you out there, I would really recommend picking this up, or really anything that Carolee Erickson wrote, because I still have a few of her books that I need to pick up, but I just think that she's always going to be a historical fiction author that I go to. Now let's go into a completely different direction and talk about some YA fantasy, I guess we can say. And the next book that I have here I actually got in an Owl Crate, and it was an additional book to what we were supposed to get, so we got a double book bonus here. And it's a debut author from an indie publisher over in the UK, and I'm so happy that I got this book because I never would have found it, but I absolutely loved it. And that is Catching Stars by Kayla Keenan. And I tweeted her actually not too long ago just begging for when the next book is coming out, and she said she's working on it right now, and I'm hoping that it comes out next year because I loved this story so much. It was so immersive in the magic system, which was super interesting, in the politics, which just completely changed my viewpoint on what YA fantasy politics could be. Like, I just really appreciated this story so much. It was constantly action-packed. I didn't feel like there was a dull moment in it, and the two characters that we follow, I didn't find myself wanting to sort of fly through any particular chapters because I wasn't interested. Like, they each had their own really interesting storyline, but when they came together it was even better, and I just felt like this was an amazing debut novel for this author. Now, sci-fi is not one that I get into very readily, aside from certain subgenres of sci-fi, but this next book I had to include because I read it earlier this year and I had never read anything quite like it before. The format was something completely different, completely new, and it blew my mind with what it actually did. And that, of course, is Illuminate by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. The way that it's written is probably the most talked about thing, and that is the fact that it's in mixed media. So everything that you're reading is either in transcript form or video surveillance or chats, and it's just so well done. And the way that it sort of combines everything together to this amazing story arc with all of these really interesting characters was so intriguing to me. I love how there's some thriller aspects, some horror aspects, there's some romance, but then there's also twists and turns. I laughed, I cried, I hyperventilated. It was so well done. Bird and the Blade by Megan Bannon. This book just exploded my expectations because this is also a debut book from an author, and she's hilarious, by the way. If you follow her on social media, absolutely hilarious. But this book destroyed me. Like, if you want to talk about books that just rip your heart out, that's what this is. It's based on the opera Turandot, and if you have not watched that opera, if you have not read up on it, I would recommend not doing so because I feel like you're just going to get spoiled for the story. But the way that Megan Bannon is able to interweave different time periods and flashbacks and things like that just is absolutely mesmerizing, and she does it in such a really good way that it just works so well with the layout of the story. So you're sort of flipping between present day in the Mongol Empire and then also flashing back to a few months before, but then you're also flashing back to a couple years before that. But if that scares you, please don't be scared to pick up this book because she does it brilliantly, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Just be prepared to, again, have your heart ripped out. It is a YA historical fiction, but it reads like a fantasy because there are kind of mystical elements, even though it's not fantasy. But the fact that it takes place in the Mongol Empire can read that way because it's so different to obviously the world that we live in now that it could be perceived as something completely fantastical. The next one that I have here should be of no surprise to anybody, or at least you should all have heard of it by now, and that is Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. And this series, don't hate me, but I prefer the Infernal Devices to the original Shadowhunters series because it's set in Victorian England and it's kind of steampunky because you have automatons, but then you also have the really epic badassery of Shadowhunters, and it just mixes so many things that I love together. And one thing too that this series does really, really well is the love triangle, wherein you are okay with anything happening. Like, you understand why there's a love triangle, you understand the relationship that they all have, because this underlying plot just is just so good. I absolutely love this series, and I'm so happy that she's continuing on with these characters soon that I cannot wait. And Will is mine, so nobody can take him. I feel like this book was just, it meant so much to me in a time that I needed it, and I just think that everybody should read this series if you have the time. But that is the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, particularly the first book, Wizard's First Rule. This book came to me in a time that I had recently injured my hand and I had to go to physiotherapy for like a year and a half. And what my physiotherapist, I have told this story before, but what my physiotherapist had me do was, as I was reading this series, because he knew how much I loved reading and how much I loved fantasy, that he had me write chapter sort of summaries and chapter reviews for the books as I read them. So I did have to write them by hand because it was part of my actual physiotherapy, but I absolutely, I adore this series. Richard Seifer and Kaylin Amnell are just two of my favorite characters ever, and I have reread this book and a few of the books in the series a few times, and I would say that this series was probably my first actual epic adult fantasy series that I had ever read. And I picked up one of the books when I was 16 because I did not realize that it was one of like the last books in the series. I had just picked it up because it looked really interesting, but when I found out that it was one of the last books in the series, I immediately went back and got all of the first, second, third, up to like the 11th in the series, so then that way I could just binge them because I loved them so much. I don't know how Terry Goodkind does it. He just, constant action, constant adventure, so many characters, such politics. I can't. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and this is probably known to everybody anyway, but this follows the story of Claire and her journey from being in the 1940s to like traveling to the 1700s and becoming part of the whole politics of the Jacobites and falling in love with two different men, and it's just, it's so amazing. And I had flipped by this book several times throughout the years, but I actually didn't pick it up until it came to Showcase, I believe it is, that the show is on. So I read this book just before I started watching the show, and it is so well adapted. I could not get over how well the first season adapted from the book to the show. It was just amazing to me. It also includes probably one of the toughest few chapters that I've ever had to read ever, and it's right near the end of the story, but it's just so amazingly beautifully well done that I even though I could hardly get myself to read it, like I was almost peering through my fingers to read those sections and felt such a physical sickness while reading them. It was just so amazing how she actually did everything and how the rest of the story was, that I don't think this is going to be a story that leaves my mind anytime soon. Now, I am a lover of classic fairy tales, of adventure, of fantasy, and when you can get all of those sort of ideas together into a story, that is mucho bueno to me. And I don't know why I'm talking like that. I'd never say that, but apparently that's how it makes me feel. And that is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. This story is like the storybook of my dreams. I absolutely adored this beautiful, fantastical journey that Tristan and Yvain are on. I love this book so much, and I feel like so many people have not read this book but need to read the book. There is so much that happens in this story. It's not a particularly long book, but there are witches, there are daredevils, there's just adventure and magic and stars coming down from the sky. It's just absolutely beautiful, and I return to this book fairly often, and I just think that so many people should read the book. And the movie I actually go back to a fair amount as well, even though they changed Tristan's name to Tristan, which is fine, but it's just weird that they just decided to tweak it just that little bit, so then that way maybe it rolls off the tongue better. But anyway, this story is just beautiful, and if you have not read it yet, definitely do, and I can definitely picture reading this book to my kids eventually, that I hopefully get. I say that it's hard to gauge which books are my absolute all-time favorites, but if there was ever a book that is one of my all-time favorites, it's definitely going to be this book as one of them, and that is Poison Study by Maria V. Snyder. This story I read in my final years of high school, and I returned to it at least once a year since then. So I have been reading this book at least once a year for like 13 years, which is insane. It's probably one of my most reread books, and it's starting to actually like come away almost because I read it so much. I recently, well, for Christmas last year, I ended up getting a signed first edition of this book, and I almost cried because I don't know what it is about this book. It's a fantasy book. It has assassins in it. It has an amazing government that's corrupt. It has a badass, fierce female character, and so many lovable characters beyond that, and hateable characters, and it just opens up to an amazing story. And I feel like, for most people, I could be talking about so many different fantasy books, but for whatever reason, this one is just always stuck with me, and will always stick with me, and Elena and Valak are, like, everything to me. And if you have not read this series yet, please do. I remember when this was just 3 books. Like, it's now 6 books plus a couple of novellas, but I remember when this was finished the first time, and I was so gutted that I wouldn't be able to return to this world anymore, that it was done at 3 books, and I waited like 6 years. And then she got new representation, and, well, Maria V. Snyder got new representation, and then they wanted more from this world, and she had enough to write 3 more books around these 2 people, and I just absolutely love it. I remember the moment that I heard that there was going to be another 3 books coming out in this series, and I was so excited. So when I talk about 30 books in 30 years, this is one of the books that has been with me through so much. No matter where I am, I have to have this book available. I absolutely love this book. Now, there is going to be one genre that you're not going to see a lot of in this list, and that is thrillers or mysteries, because I find it very difficult to get into thrillers and mysteries because I don't usually find them well done, and I usually know who the murderer is, or I just feel like they try too hard. There are so many issues that I have, unfortunately, with thrillers, but this one really got me, and it's not necessarily the thriller aspect to it, it's just the world that it's in, the idea behind it, and the characters within it that really keep it grounded but make me return to it every year when a new one is released. And that is City of the Lost by Kelly Armstrong. Now, this story is basically covering this woman who lives in the States, and she has a history of being assaulted, but then she goes on to become a cop and a detective and a homicide detective. And then her friend gets into a really bad situation, and in order to get her away, they find out that there is this sort of hidden underground, well, not underground, but like stealthy town that takes in people who need help, or takes in people who can pay their way out of the world, essentially, and it is hidden up in the Yukon territories. And I just thought that that was such an interesting premise, and this character, the main character Casey, and her friend Diana end up going up to this place, and she becomes a homicide detective in a town where there are so many killers and criminals and other people who can pay to be there, and she has to solve these cases every time that a new book comes out. And I just really love the premise, and like I said, I love the characters, so everything that this book does is so amazing. I just have so much fun reading them, and I whip through them super quick as well. And the next one comes out in February, I believe, and I'm so excited because that's going to be book 4. And then Kelly Armstrong also announced that this is very close to being adapted into a TV show as well, and that is something that has me really interested. I just hope that they do it well, but I hear that they're going to be hiring actors that match the actual diversity that this book has, so I'm excited for it. Brave Mercy by Robin Lefebvre. Now, I only have book 1, I have only read book 1, and I am okay with that. I know that there are other books in the series and that she's returning to the world as well soon in another book that's coming out, but this, even as a standalone, amazing. I absolutely loved it. It is all about these nuns that are basically assassins. So they don't get married, they don't fall in love, but they have been touched by the mark of Mortain, which lets them see how somebody is going to die, and then they enact that death. So in this book, we follow a girl who was recently married off because her father basically just wants to be rid of her, because they did try to terminate her birth and she survived, and she has been marked by Mortain, and so she ends up getting whisked away to this nunnery where she trains to become an assassin. And then she ends up meeting up with this guy who is essentially an aristocrat of the crown, and he runs into her a couple of times, and then they end up having to work together because the queen is basically at risk of being assassinated, so they're trying to find the assassin before the queen gets killed, and there's so much more that happens in the story. It was such a fun reread that I did recently for this that I remembered pretty much everything that had happened, but my feelings when I first read the book were still the same the second time that I read the book, like 6 or 7 years later. So I really had fun with this story, and I had to include it in this as well because it's another book that has journeyed with me a long time. The next book that I have here, we are returning to an author that I have already spoken about, but that is Maria V. Snyder, and this time we're talking about the Touch of Power Healer series. And this one is another one that I absolutely adored, and the books had a way of, after each one, I was either super happy, super sad, or angry. But I loved them all so much because it was all those emotions in the best way possible. And this story follows Avery, who is the last known healer, because all of the healers had been killed. They're basically going extinct because everybody thought that they brought on this plague, so everyone is scared of the healers, even though the healers are doing their best to keep everything okay. But this girl has been on the run for the past 3 years, I believe it was, and she has been in hiding. But as she has been in hiding, there's this group who's been following her because they want to use her powers to heal their friend. There is just so much character development, there's so much story, there's so much action that I absolutely love this story. Now, I'm a big Maria V. Snyder fangirl, if you have not been able to tell. I just love the way that she does travel, like as you're in a group off on a journey. I just think that she does it so, so well, and I absolutely adore this book too. Next book here is in a genre that I find so difficult to find books in that I really, really like, but I love it so much to my core, and that's steampunk. And the book that I have here is The Ironworm Affair by Lilith St. Croix. This is a 3-book series called the Claire and Bannon series, and it follows a magician and an empath and their journey to basically help the crown. And there is, again, I keep saying, like, you'll tell that I really like a fantasy or a sci-fi book if there is a lot of adventure and action. Like, that is so much to me. I had originally anticipated a romance in this series, but I do feel like it's okay to tell you with no spoilers that you're not really going to get romance in here. This is an amazing example of a guy and a girl being friends, but partners, and being able to take care of each other but also get on each other's nerves, and I just absolutely love their relationship, and I wish that there were more books in this series, but I just thought that this was such a fun book, and it just has all of the clockwork creatures and subterfuge and mystery that I really like in a steampunk book, and I just could not get enough, again, of this series. Like I said, there's only 3 in the series, and they are quick reads, so if you kind of want to start delving into the idea of steampunk, and you enjoy mystery, and you enjoy action, and Victorian London, obviously, then this is a series that I would recommend you pick up. Now, I love classics. I read most of the classics that I love between the ages of about 10 and 16, and I was so all about the classics in those years, and one of them was definitely Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And this book, it makes me think of my mom's side of the family, because she has 4 sisters and they kind of all match with the March siblings, and I just thought that that was really cool when I was younger, but also just the love of their family and the wholesomeness of the story I really, really loved. And even though there were some points that got me really mad or really sad or just frustrated, overall this story was just beautiful, and it's another one that I really recommend. I read this in grade 6, I think. I don't know, I was like 10 initially when I read this book, and I couldn't forget it. Like, if there is, what was it, a few years ago I think it was, there was this thing going around on Facebook and Instagram where it was like, name 3 fictional characters that would describe you, and one was Belle, I mean, obviously, and then one was Hermione Granger, because again, I feel like pretty obvious, but then the other one that I had was Jo March, because her underlying thoughts and opinions and her attitude is just so much like myself that I couldn't not emulate with her character. Like, I felt like I was Jo March, and I absolutely, absolutely love this story so, so much. It's due for a reread, and I think it's been maybe about 5 years since I read this again, that I need to return back to this world and just relive it, because I love it so much. Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young, and this is the first book and the only book so far that I have found and enjoyed in the subgenre of Viking YA fantasy. This is one that it just captured my imagination. In it, there was a lot of character development. You also learned a lot about Viking lore and just what their main values were and what drove their need to fight and that sort of thing. But it also had a really, really good slow burn romance. But then you also felt like your heart beating faster when the action happened, and you were actually worried about the livelihood of basically every character, and I thought that this was so well done. There was another YA Viking book that I read after I picked this one up, but I feel like that one was so like just chock full of needless stuff, and it was way too much and too crazy. This one though did it just brilliantly. So if you want to get into YA Vikings, you want a slow burn romance, you want family values, you want amazing lore, definitely pick this one up. Onyx and Ivory by Mindy Arnett. And I love the way that Mindy Arnett writes fantasy. Like, I read some of her sci-fi, which I did enjoy, but it did not grip me nearly as much as this book. I feel like Onyx and Ivory has such a difference in opinion. Either you seem to love it or you hate it. And I was definitely a love it kind of girl, because in this book, I don't feel like there was time to stop and think. Like, it was just, stuff was happening right away. You have a main character who is a badass and she can take care of herself. She has been through heartbreak and she actually bears it very, very well. And she is very self-sufficient and she can take care of herself. But then she's also able to be vulnerable and she's also able to open up. So I really like that in a main character, and the fact that she doesn't rely on a guy, she relies on herself, is amazing. But then when you add in a relationship, when you add in a romance, it just elevates it that much more. But also, that's not even the main point of this story, because it is all about a rebellion and it is all about being able to fight for what you believe in and overthrowing those who want to do wrong to the world. And I just, oh, this book I really, really, really enjoyed, and I cannot wait for the next one to come out. This next book I picked up because I had thought that it was going to be steampunk, but it was definitely more clockwork. But I was totally okay with that because I just thought it was done so well, and that is The Clockwork Dynasty by Daniel H. Wilson. And this book is one that splits timelines. So you have present day, but then you also have like 1700s Russia and how they sort of start to come together, which you don't think is possible, but they do start to come together. I absolutely devoured this story and I want more from it. It is a standalone, but I would love to see more from this world. It was so well thought out that I could almost imagine it being a real thing. So I'm trying to keep it very vague though, because I don't want to give too much away, but it's clockwork mixed with 1700s, present day, archaeology, and action, and it's just, oh, it's so good. I'm gonna say that about all these books, they're all so good, but that's why they're on this list. This one's gonna be a little controversial, but I had to include it, and it is Me Before You by Jojo Moyes. And this one is controversial because it does touch on some triggering, really deep content that is in this story, but when I read it, I don't think it romanticized things. I think that it was very pure and honest and heartbreaking, but also uplifting, and the general final thoughts and opinions that this book is supposed to portray, I think portrayed it very, very well. And this story was just one of those that is sticking with me for a very, very long time, that I absolutely loved it. I can understand why people did not, but I feel like when I read it, I was at the right time in my life that I could understand what Jojo Moyes wanted to get across, and I feel like she had done that very, very well. So I would say that it does have mature content, and if that is something that you are okay with in regards to the discussion around euthanasia, then I would say you're okay to read this with a thoughtful eye. But if that is something that you just want nothing to do with, then I would say avoid this book. But I feel like regardless, it is a good one to read, to think critically on, but also to think thoughtfully on. And I just think that this was an amazing book to read, and I absolutely loved it. On a much lighter note, let's talk about a uplifting chick lit, and that is I've Got Your Number by Sophie Kinsella. Sophie Kinsella is one of those authors of chick lit that you just know you can go to and you're gonna get a light, fluffy read. But out of all of her books that I have read, this one I usually come back to a couple of times. Well, I have come back to a couple of times since I initially read it. And I just thought that this was such a fun story, because while you've got the rom-com elements, you've also got a little bit of business subterfuge in a way that I just thought was so fun. Basically, you have a girl and she is engaged, she loses her engagement ring, and there's a fire alarm, and she loses her phone as well. And this engagement ring was an antique. It was handed down through her fiance's family, so she needs to find it before he finds out that she lost it. And in order to do so, she has to give a phone number to the hotel that she was at. And she doesn't have a phone, but she finds one in the trash bin. So she picks it up, adopts the phone, and she adopts the life that the phone was attached to, essentially. And it's just such a comedy of errors. Alright, so they just started vacuuming in my hall, and I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm gonna try and continue on here. If you want a really quick, light, fluffy contemporary, rom-com sort of fun, I would definitely recommend this book. This next one here is going to be a little bit random, but I do also enjoy nonfiction and autobiographies and things like that, and I just felt like I needed to include this one because I have been a fan of this blog since, well, it's going to be for about the last 10 years, and it is Nerd Fitness, and it's run by Steve Kamb, but he wrote a few years ago now a sort of companion book to his blog as or almost a self-improvement book, but it was just so fun. Anyway, that is Level Up Your Life, and this book, what's the subtitle again? How to Unlock Adventure and Happiness by Becoming the Hero of Your Own Story. And I love RPG, I love just really fun game aspects like leveling up and things like that, and this book sort of helps you do that in your own life. So I just had such an interesting time reading this book and just trying to adapt things that he said into my everyday life. Like, he talks about fitness, he talks about wellness, he talks about self-improvement, and it's just such a good all-encompassing nerdy well-being book. Next book here is one from a genre which I really don't read a lot of, and that is YA contemporary. It's just, it doesn't really get my attention because it's high school and it's catty and it's just, I'm not really intrigued by that. But there is one author that I think does a brilliant YA contemporary that reads older than it's actually intended, and that is John Green, particularly The Fault in Our Stars, which was a juggernaut of a story that was written by obviously John Green, who was part of the Vlogbrothers. I've been following the Vlogbrothers since 2007, and as I know most people have, and I remember so vividly his journey of documenting writing this story. I remember him living in Amsterdam with his family, and I remember him signing all the pre-orders, of which I purchased one, and it was just such an all-encompassing journey from start to finish that I really felt like I was a part of this story. Not to mention the fact of actually reading this story and knowing what it's about. It was just such a beautiful, beautiful journey that I went on with this book. And I bawled my eyes out. It was heart-wrenching. It was heartwarming. It was everything and more that I could have wanted in a YA contemporary. And I feel like everybody needs to read this. I would love for it to be required reading in schools, and I just think that it is a beautiful message and I absolutely love it. So the next book that I have here is, I believe, the first book that I have read with the subplot of YA pirates, and I absolutely love it. I just couldn't get enough of this story. But it is These Rebel Waves by Sarah Rosh. And I cannot believe I have to wait a year until the sequel comes out, because when I read this book, I have already gone back and reread the last third, because the ending just blew my mind. I couldn't get over it. I was basically hyperventilating when I was reading it, and I ended up Snapchatting my friend, and I was just basically incoherent with my thoughts about how I just needed the next book because of this ending. It was such a good, amazing, action-packed ride with pirates and just amazingness. It had a really good political system, it had an underlying note of revolution, well, a big note of revolution in it, and it was just so well done. This book follows 3 points of views. One is a politician, one is a pirate, and one is a prince. And I just think that these points of views are so important, even though when I was initially reading the prince's points of view, I was kind of, let's get to the others because they're a lot more interesting. Definitely pay attention to his stuff though, because they are important. So Overall though, this story was just amazing, and I cannot get over that ending. Like, that ending was everything. Alright, now let's jump back into classics, because I have Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen here. And I could have picked many of Jane Austen's works, but I'm gonna go with the classic Pride and Prejudice because this book was so big in my life when I was younger that I just absolutely adored Darcy and Elizabeth, and the whole world that Jane Austen wrote in was so fascinating to me, and the fact that Jane Austen was beyond her time and how she felt about women's rights, and I really, really loved Jane Austen. I still love Jane Austen. I do want to do a reread of all of her stuff because it's been a while since I was back in her written world, that I feel like this is a rite of passage that everybody should read and really think critically on, but also just enjoy, because it's such a fun story. And the next one here is one that I read this year, but I think it's instantly becoming a all-time classic favorite for me because it was just so enchanting, was the best way that I could describe it. And that is the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer and Annie Barrows, who are actually, I believe, aunt and niece, and I just think that that's adorable that they wrote a book together. But this book is also written not in chapter format, but in letter format, and I initially thought that that would not really be able to grab me into the story as much, but it did so almost even more than what I could have possibly expected, because it gets into the minds of so many characters, putting their thoughts onto paper, and it was just such a beautiful, beautiful read, and I just think that so many people should read it. Also, the movie came out on Netflix in August, and I watched that after I read the book, and they did it well to transition from this format to a film, and they did make some pretty big character change choices, but I think it worked for the film, whereas with the book, I feel like if they did the same thing that the movie did, it just would not have read as well. But this one I loved. It does have a bit of a love triangle in it, but that's not really a point of contention. It just happens. But the story of this literary society and Elizabeth and the people all within it, I absolutely loved it so, so much, and I wish that I was Juliet, because she is me if I was really self-confident, and I just absolutely adored her character. I loved Guernsey Island. I want to go to Guernsey now because of this, and I just think that it's such a beautiful atmosphere that it gives, and it's just such a touching story that I think that so many people should read it. Like, I believe this has won awards, and I can understand why. So pick this book up if you're a lover of historical fiction, if you're really interested in like World War II, 1940s era. Definitely pick this up for a read. I don't think you'll be disappointed. This is probably, as of filming this video, the second last book that I had read, and I had a blog from like 2012 up until last year, which I had recently sort of canceled and stopped doing just because I couldn't put forth all the effort that I wanted to into it. But back in 2014 on my blog, I wrote a post of most anticipated books coming out in 2015, and this book was on the list. I ended up not picking it up in 2015, but the hype was real for this book, and it scared me, and I was afraid that it would A, not live up to the hype, or B, I just wouldn't like it, or just any multitude of things that could happen, and I just got scared. I picked it up last year finally, and I felt like I was in a good enough place that I could devote myself to a new amazing series to take over my life, and I'm so glad that I finally read this book. I've been waiting to read it for like 3 years, and it's finally happened, and I'm a devoted member to this fan base now, and that is A Darker Shade of Magic by Victoria Schwab. Well, V.E. Schwab for her adult reads. I have not read anything by her aside from this book, but I love it. I love it so much. Kel and Lila are some of my favorite things, and the ideas and the imagery that this book puts forth, and just the sheer genius of it and the way that it's written, I'm gushing so much about this book that it's the last thing that I think about before I go to bed, and I dream about it, and it's just, the hype was real with this one, people. It was so good. And this book, if it works out, I'm hoping to base a cosplay around, or like my Halloween costume around, because I have ideas and I just want to do it so bad, because these characters, oh my god, these characters, oh my god, these worlds, is just absolutely brilliant. It's mind-bendy, it's genius. I love the magic, I love the world jumping, I love everything about this book. And I want to read the next one now, and the one after that, and I just want to completely devote myself to this series, and I understand so much why people gush about this series, that I just don't think, if you like fantasy, I don't think you'll be disappointed with this one, because it's just, I was on the money when I said it was the most anticipated when it was first released, and I just wish that it did not take me this long to get up the courage to read it. Second last one here, people, and it is a biggin, but I'm only going to focus on one story within it, but it's the complete works of William Shakespeare. This book, let me tell you, it is a mess, it is ratty, and while normally I would be really terrified about that, where I would hate seeing a book like this, I can't fault this from happening to this book, because it was in my backpack every single day for like a good year, because this was my Bible. I did not go anywhere without this book. It has still like flags in it, it's all a mess, I've got things on the sonnets, I've got things on Romeo and Juliet, which in particular is the book that I want to focus on mainly within this, because it is a classic. I remember hearing about it from when I was very young. I feel like Romeo and Juliet has just always been known in my life, and when I really started to show like an aptitude and a love of classic literature and of just reading Shakespeare and reading a bit beyond my age group, I had wanted this book. I looked at it every time I went into the bookstore. I just was always drawn to it. And for Christmas, when I was in grade 5, my parents got it for me. And I was so happy. I just remember living in these pages, and it was just everything to me. I can't get over how much I loved Shakespeare when I was younger. I still love the Bard. But I mean, just the fact that I was in grade 5 and I wanted this book, and my mom told me that when she went in to pick it up, the cashier had asked, "Oh, do you have a child going into literature in college or anything like that?" And my mom was like, "No, this is for my 10-year-old child." And I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty proud of that fact, that I was so young reading these books and being able to somewhat understand them, because when I was younger and I was reading bigger books or books that had a vocabulary more than what I knew, then I had a dictionary beside me as well, because these were the times before Google, before all of the internets and all of that. So I had a dictionary beside me while I was reading, so then that way I could translate. But then I also had another version of Shakespeare that had modern language too. So I just sort of connected all of those together into an understanding of these stories and of these plays. And this was such a big part of my preteen years that I couldn't not include this. Now we are on to the final book. And there is a book that you're probably thinking, Kaylee, come on. There is a book, there is a series that you have not included yet. Now just include it, for crying out loud. And we have come to that moment. And that moment is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by the Queen herself, J.K. Rowling. This series was so big, is still so big. It is a part of my everything now, and I don't think that I can go back to a time when Harry Potter was not in my life. I am a diehard Ravenclaw with a bit of Gryffindor, so I guess Gryffindor if you want to amalgamate those two houses. When I first read the series, I thought it was Gryffindor all the way, but I've come to terms in the last like 10 years or so that I am definitely a Ravenclaw. That being said, this book series I did not want to read initially. I was very much of the mind that I didn't want to read like the average person. I wanted to read books that not everybody had read, and I wanted to not think about all of those books, and I just wanted to be different in a way. But that being said, when these books came out, I was in what grade was I in? Grade 6, I want to say? I think it was in grade 6 or something like that. But I didn't get right on board with this series. It took me until the first movie came out, because in those years when this first started to come over to Canada, the kids in my class would call me Hermione. And I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't get it. I knew kind of that it was a Harry Potter reference. And the first movie came out, and I went to see it, and I fell in love. And I immediately got the first book and just devoured it front to back because I just couldn't get enough of it. And then that year for Christmas, my grandma had bought me the rest of the books that had already been released by that time, and that was book 2 through 4. Yeah, 2 through 4, and I got them for Christmas, and over Christmas holiday, I read all of those. And I just couldn't get enough of the world of Harry Potter, and from that moment on, I was just devoted to it forever. And now we're here today, where I've been to the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. I have sorted myself on Pottermore. I have Harry Potter paraphernalia. I know my Hogwarts house. I know my Patronus, and I listen to MuggleCast every week. And it's just, I just can't imagine not being a fan of Harry Potter now. And I wish I had those couple extra years before the films came out, just so that way I had more time with it in my life. But that being said, everybody knows what this story is about. Everybody knows Harry Potter, and I love it so much. Now you may be wondering what those pages were that were sticking out. Back in 2002, when I was 13, I drew the cover. I don't know if you can really see that, but I decided to recreate the cover, but in just drawing it. So yeah, I was 13, and I just couldn't get enough Harry Potter, so I would just draw it. And now those live inside my copy. But now that it's like the 20-year anniversaries of everything that's coming up now, I'm collecting the series in Ravenclaw colors. So I just love how like 21 years later now, this book is still so important to the world that I can't get over what a juggernaut of a series this is and continues to be, and how many people have devoted their love of reading to this book. And I can't gush about it enough, and I just love it dearly, and I can't talk about it anymore because A, my voice is getting very hoarse, and I can just keep saying that I love it, I love it, I love it. And I guess that is where I'm going to end it. That is 30 books for 30 years. I still can't believe that I'm 30 years old on the day that you're watching this. Like, that just blows my mind so much, and I'm so excited to see where the next years take me, where this channel takes me, and where the next decade of reading will take me. And please be sure to like this video if you have made it this far, if you love any of the books that I talked about, and leave comments down below too if you have read any of these books, if you want to read any of these books. Let me know what are some of the best books that you have read throughout your life, because it's just such a lovely thing to have that Books are everything. I love them so much. I just get starry-eyed when I think about books. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos. I put out new videos every weekend and then sometimes throughout the week if I have bonus ones. So be sure to also click that bell notification if you don't want to miss a video. And until next time, keep reading.